Porgy and Bess, one of the most iconic, controversial, misunderstood, most frequently performed and beloved, contradictory and complicated operas of all time. You could write a book about it. In fact, many people have written books about it. What we're looking at here in the center is one of the great interpretations of George Gershwin's score, Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, and right around the same time, Miles Davis made a recording of the music as conceived by Gil Evans, and these two records are among the greatest performances. And of course, Summertime, the most famous song to come out of the opera, has been performed, still is performed as we're hearing here, to this very day. And on the left, we see an advertisement for the original production of Porgy and Bess, and you can see the caricatures, which we would characterize as racist. It's important to remember that at the time that the opera came out, these kind of images were very, very much part of the way that African American art, experience, people were presented in mainstream media. And it underlines, again, the issues that come up when one confronts Porgy and Bess. And that's what we're going to look into. Porgy and Bess is the result of the collaboration of these two people. On the left, DuBose Heyward, born in 1885 in Charleston, South Carolina, and New York City's George Gershwin, born in 1898. And they're both seen with their mothers and their siblings in these photographs. And both Heyward and Gershwin were profoundly influenced and affected by African American culture from young children. And the way that they dealt with that is very different. And it was that combination of approaches to the challenge of ultimately putting Porgy, the book Porgy, as we'll find out, into Porgy and Bess, putting it on the stage, had a lot to do with their attitudes about this great influence in their art. George Gershwin, as a very young man, had a huge hit tune. It was introduced by Al Jolson, and the tune is Swanee. It's a tune you still hear performed today, over 100 years after it was originally a hit tune. It was one of those Southern songs written by a Northerner about the great things about the South and how he wants to go back to Dixie and all those kind of things. George Gershwin loved jazz, and he was a frequent hanger-outer at the famous piano parties and events that featured people like James P. Johnson and Willie the Lion Smith. In fact, Gershwin winds up in Willie the Lion Smith's autobiography, where supposedly Gershwin, who was known to be quite a bit of a ham, was sitting at the piano, and Willie the Lion Smith went up and he quotes himself as saying, "Get up off that piano stool, you tomato." But he was respected by these folks, because Gershwin could write beautiful music and he could certainly play the piano well. But we're going to follow this with just a brief sample of one of the musicians that inspired the whole Gershwin idiom so much. This is Willie the Lion Smith. It wasn't long after Swanee River became a big hit in 1919, 1920, that Gershwin began composing popular tunes, of which a string of them became very famous, eventually mostly written with his brother Ira, in a series of revues and Broadway shows throughout the 1920s. His biggest success in terms of becoming a serious composer was, of course, the Rhapsody in Blue, premiered with Paul Whiteman in 1924. But if we're looking for a precedent for what eventually got channeled into Porgy and Bess in 1934 and 1935, it comes from a relatively obscure piece called Blue Monday, which was a small opera. I wouldn't call it an operetta, but a small opera that he composed in 1922. It made some noise commercially when it came out, but it was largely forgotten. But it's here that we really get a feeling for what eventually turned into Porgy and Bess well over a decade later. We're going to hear a 12-minute excerpt from this piece, Blue Monday, and listen for it. It's gorgeous on its own, but again, it shows the way that Gershwin was thinking. He turned 24 years old that year. Gershwin wasn't alone of trying to put the African American idiom into larger forms, even into opera. And here we have two very important figures who preceded him by many, many, many years. On the left, Will Marion Cook, who was a wonderful violinist, eventually composer, arranger, mentor to Duke Ellington, among others. And Cook was among the musicians who gathered around Dvorak when he came over to America in 1893 at the behest of Jeanette Thurber to teach American composers how to write quote-unquote classical music. And that's when Dvorak famously said, to paraphrase him, you already have your great music over here, Negro spirituals. If you want to imitate what we do in Europe, that's your business. And on the right, we have Scott Joplin, famous for being one of the great ragtime composers, the Maple Leaf Rag, and so many other things. He actually wrote an opera that didn't get very far during his lifetime. It was called Tremonisha. And it was eventually staged many years later. Gunther Schuller had a hand in it, and then it started to be performed around the world. And we will watch an excerpt of Tremonisha right here, adding again to the background to what eventually set the stage for something like Porgy and Bess. Tremonisha is from 1912. This performance, obviously, is from much later.
We may forgive them for your sake. For sake we will forgive them. Let us now shake hands with these men.
And at the same time that Gershwin was working on Blue Monday and eventually his big breakthrough, which is coming just next, there were African-American artists and arrangers and composers very much on the Broadway scene. Florence Mills, on the right, was a great star who died tragically early in her life. She died in 1927. No recordings exist of her. She was just about to make her first recording. Ellington wrote Black Beauty in tribute to her. On the left, Will Votary, who was a wonderful composer, orchestrator, who worked for Florence Ziegfeld. And Florence Ziegfeld was the biggest Broadway producer, especially in the musical realm, of the era. So this is just kind of setting the context within which all these things are happening on the music side of Porgy. We'll get to the literary side in just a moment. Now that we've covered the musical evolution of George Gershwin up through the Rhapsody in Blue, which really put him in the place to be considered to write operas, although it was many years later, now we get to the literary side, and here is where the story of Porgy comes from. It was a novel written by DuBose Hayward, published in 1925. It was a huge hit, and it was thought to represent the true story of African-American life, and it was set in the waterfront in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Catfish Row. It was a place that DuBose Hayward knew as a child, and he set these characters through his eyes, and we see the depictions on the cover, and a lot of the cliches and prejudicial stereotypes of African Americans exist in this novel, along with more complicated sketches of character. But it's a sketch from outside. I guess that goes without saying. We're kind of jumping ahead right here. We're going to get into the context out of which Porgy came. But here is an excerpt of James Baldwin's writing about the opera Porgy and Bess. And he says, what has always been missing from George Gershwin's opera is what the situation of Porgy and Bess says about the white world. It is because of this omission that Americans are so proud of the opera. It assuages their guilt about Negroes, and it attacks none of their fantasies. This is James Baldwin on the opera Porgy and Bess. Long before DuBose Hayward chose to write his view of African-American life in Porgy, African-American authors such as George Washington Cable had written The Grandissimes and Charles W. Chestnut's The Colonel's Dream was a wonderful book. And a little bit later on, Walter F. White, who became head of the NAACP, had written The Fire in the Flint. So you see, there was a context for writing about African-American life. None of these wound up being chosen to become an opera for the Metropolitan Opera, but these books did exist. The insanity of racism in the United States is really represented by digging a little bit into DuBose Hayward, who wrote this book that he very well might have thought was an honest depiction of the culture that he saw in and around his native Charleston, South Carolina, around Catfish Row. But it's complicated, especially when we consider that he himself was the founder of the Poetry Society of South Carolina. Now, there was a feeling among Southern writers, Southern white writers, that they were the object of prejudice from Northern writers, and that their work wasn't taken seriously. So this organization that he put together, and which did publish some wonderful things, was nonetheless segregated. In fact, there's a well-known story that there was an African-American author who submitted something to be published in their review. It was accepted, but when they found out that he was an African-American, they would not let him join, and they would not publish the work. And there we have one of the great contradictions, or maybe it's not a contradiction, portrait of how race and the history of race in America plays into not only the story itself of Porgy and Bess, but the story of the people who created it and its legacy, its complicated legacy. The novel Porgy, which again came out in 1925, was such a hit that it became a Broadway play, and it was expanded from the book by Hayward and his wife Dorothy. And it was such a big hit. All kinds of great actors were in it. A man named Charles Gilpin played Porgy famously. And there was music in the play too, but it wasn't music written specifically for Porgy. They interpolated spirituals. So it wasn't a musical, it was a drama, but there was music in it. Now, the way that Gershwin and DuBose Hayward came together was that just a couple of years after Porgy was a huge hit on Broadway, George Gershwin was really at a peak in his career. The 1920s had seen him and his brother Ira, who was a lyricist, write hit show after hit show. The tunes were so popular. And in the early 30s, Gershwin was actually to win a Pulitzer Prize for his musical Of Thee I Sing, which attacked the hypocrisy of the political class. Well, anyway, Gershwin was commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera to write an opera. And his original choice was a very famous play called The Dybbuk, which in Yiddish theater and Jewish theater was kind of a ghoulish kind of fantasy. And it was going to turn into an opera. Gershwin dithered and he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. And there's actually an article here saying that he's writing this grand opera, but he's not sure, and maybe he's going to do Porgy instead. Well, it took years for this to resolve itself. By 1934, George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward were in gear to produce this opera that would become Porgy and Bess. And they decided to meet in the Low Country off of the Carolinas, some of the Sea Islands down there, and that Gershwin would stay there. Here we see photographs of him there, and he would immerse himself in this individual culture that had evolved off of the Atlantic Ocean with a different language spoken, Gullah, and that by spending a relatively short amount of time there, a couple of months, he would somehow intuit how to write this music. He spent a lot of time in the African American churches, and we'll hear now just a very short excerpt of some of the actual music that Gershwin heard at that time that he wanted to put into his musical portrait for Porgy. Gershwin took those sounds and a lot of other sounds and put them together for Porgy and Bess. And here we will hear an excerpt from a recording that Gershwin had made for his own study so he could hear some of the sounds that were coming out during the rehearsals of Porgy and Bess. It's quite astounding. He's playing the piano at the beginning. You'll hear him singing some of the figures, and then everything comes in. The singers are Todd Duncan and Ann Brown. More about them in just a moment. But first, let's hear this music.
We will start with the piano solo at 5 bars before 9, because the piano has a solo lasting about 2 minutes, which we will not waste time with now. 5 bars before 9, scene 1. Wow. we go to number 56 in the first act, which is a song called A Woman is a Sometime Thing, and which will be sung by Mr. Edward Matthews. Three bars before 56, sir. Three bars.
Oh, listen to your daddy warn you. Oh, your heart's a traveling. Woman may warn you, love you and warn you, but a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. Your mammy is the first to name you, and she'll tie you to her apron string. Then she'll shame you and she'll blame you till your woman comes to claim you. Oh, a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. Don't you never let a woman grieve you just 'cause she's got your wedding ring. She'll love you and deceive you, then she'll take your clothes and leave you. Oh, a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime. There now, what I tells you, he's asleep already.
And now we will play a little bit of the orchestra part of the finale of Scene 1, Act 1. What number? What is it? 156. Number 156. 156. Ready? 156. One flat. Ready? Now we have a song by Miss Ruby Elsie in the second act, Scene 1, called My Man Is Gone Now. I'm sorry, it's in Scene 2, Act 1. Now we'll have the duet from the first scene of Act Two of Porgy, sung by Todd Duncan and Bess, who's played by Anne Brown. Number.
That's 95.
All right. Right up. 95.
95 in Act 2, Scene 1.
And please give me 3 bars before, by Shelley. 3 bars before 95 in the same scene. Ready? 4. Don Marco.
Nothing could have happened in Porgy and Bess if Gershwin had not been able to find superlative singers slash actors to be in the starring roles, and he did. He found Todd Duncan and Anne Brown, who created the roles, and many people feel they've never been surpassed. How can you surpass the originals? Let's look at a short tribute to Todd Duncan that was done on local television in Washington, D.C. He taught for many years at Howard University, and they put this together shortly after he passed. It has some interview material with him, and this is certainly an appropriate place to pay tribute to him and get a feeling for the challenges that faced a whole generation of opera singers, specifically Todd Duncan.
I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got no car.
From more than 100 of the best baritones of the day, George Gershwin personally selected the unknown Todd Duncan as the first Porgy. The role would be a springboard to more than a decade of Broadway, opera, and concert stardom. His name up in lights, he should have been living the American dream. But these were the 1930s and 40s, and there was no escaping the American nightmare: segregation.
People stomping, and then hundreds of people backstage asking for your autograph, and you cannot go in the restaurant to eat or to take care of your needs physically next door. You have the money, you have the clothes, you have everything else, but you're the wrong color, so you can't go in. It is frustrating, to say the least.
In those days, even the nation's capital had a segregated theater, and when Porgy was slated to play it, the pain of facing an all-white audience in his hometown became too much.
I just made a moral commitment and said, I will not sing at that National Theater if my friends and my peers can't come. It was simple as that. I couldn't negotiate or anything, my soul. And so I got in a great deal of trouble with my own union and with my own board and with my own producers. I became a rebel, a rebel Negro, because I wouldn't appear.
National Theater finally bowed to the star's demand, and later he shattered another color barrier, becoming the first African American to sing with the New York City Opera. Duncan happened to make civil rights history, when all he was trying to do was make beautiful music.
In her quiet place.
I have touched sometimes, a few times in my life, St. Peter's Gate, and I've seen the gold and the silver and all, and the angels and all, right on the concert stage. And the critics knew it, the audience knew it. But I've known it was not a perfect concert.
This is one of precious few recordings of Todd Duncan singing in his prime. A promised contract with a major label in the 1940s evaporated because the company had already signed Marian Anderson.
It has nothing to do with art, has nothing to do with your singing, but we won't be able to sell you because we already have one Negro, and that's the quota. Yes, I have one great regret, and that's it.
Todd Duncan spent the first half of his life perfecting his talent, the second half passing it on, teaching voice well into his 90s. And as long as recordings like this one survive, he will continue to teach lessons about life.
I believe that if you work and you study, and there is real deep commitment in what you know, and that every hour of the day, every day in the week is a testimony to who you are and what you're doing, why, nobody can touch that, not even prejudice. They may try, but they fail.
Most will remember him as the first Porgy, some as a champion of the arts, humanities, or equal rights. All of that a little too lofty for Todd Duncan.
I like to be remembered as one who loved what he was doing, and he was doing what he wanted to do. He never tired of trying to do it better, and he did it his way. He was happy doing it, with all the pitfalls, with all of the stumbling blocks. They didn't mean much to him. He still got a joy out of his work.
Over tens of thousands of miles.
Porgy and Bess created quite a stir when it came out, but it really didn't obtain iconic status internationally and for many other opera companies until the early 1950s, when there was a very famous international tour of it. However, here are some reviews, contemporary reviews of when it first came out. The New York American at the bottom, one by Isaac Goldberg at the top, and you can take your time and read them, but they don't even seem to consider the possibilities that there could be an opera about African American life written by an African American composer. That's not even broached. Interesting. The African American press of the time was far more critical of Porgy and Bess, naturally, because it was perceived as being, a true statement about a group of people. I can tell you that I have watched Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly, which is certainly a masterpiece and which certainly has some of the most beautiful music ever written. I've watched it with people from Japan, and they laugh because the music has nothing to do with Japanese music, and the characterizations are just, overblown stereotypes with not much depth. But the music is so profound and so beautiful that it kind of colors the way that people look at the dramatic content and the way that the individuals themselves and their social context are represented. That's one of the problems. The opera itself is one thing. The music of Porgy and Bess has been tremendously influential. Summertime is a song that I think it's fair to say that there's someone, probably much more than one, at least one person in every country on the planet who knows Summertime and can sing it or play it. It's that popular. Here we see just a handful of the jazz versions of Porgy and Bess that came out shortly after the international tour of the early 1950s, which really kind of put it back on the map. But of all the jazz versions, the Miles Davis recording of Porgy and Bess probably has been the most famous, and certainly his rendition of Summertime ranks as just one of the most iconic recordings of the 20th century. And it's a sound and a vibration that continues to excite and inspire young musicians to create something new, to put their own stamp on it. And that's certainly one of the best things to come out of the very complicated story of Porgy and Bess. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Jazz for Curious Listeners. I'm Lauren Schoenberg, the senior scholar at the museum, and on behalf of everyone at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, from Tracy Heider-Suffren, our executive director, to the rest of the staff and the board, I want to thank you for joining us. And please remember that the programming that the National Jazz Museum in Harlem does is very wide. This is part of our historic series, but we have all kinds of contemporary things going on, performances and discussions and things you probably can't even imagine. And you can find out about them on our website, www.jmih.org, on our Facebook page, and certainly hope that you will consider supporting the museum in its mission.